He barked once, then twice, and then he wouldn't stop. No matter how hard they tried to pull him away from the coffin, Max kept barking, as if the soul inside hadn't truly left her worse, shouldn't have been silenced. But when the young man next door finally asked why, the town's beloved priest began to sweat, and everything unraveled from there. The bark beneath the oak tree. Spring Hollow was the kind of town that aged like antique wine, quiet, familiar, and cloaked in the safety of long-standing routines. But that peace shattered on the morning of Grace Thompson's funeral. Under the ancient oak tree behind the chapel, the mourners wept in stillness until Max, her Labrador, began barking at her casket with a fury no one could explain. And beside him, a man no one really knew, Eli Grant, stood frozen, the first seed of doubt taking root in his gut. A doubt that would uncover more than just a crime. Spring Hollow sat nestled in the foothills of northern Virginia, where the morning fog often clung to the past like cobwebs in an attic. It was mid-autumn, and the air was draped in a chill that smelled of dry leaves, damp earth, and distant memory. The sky hung low and gray over the old oak tree behind St. Jude's Chapel, a tree so wide its limbs had shaded generations of farewells. Today, it cast its reach over the coffin of Grace Thompson. Grace had been 72 when she passed, or so they said. A slender, silver-haired woman with sharp blue eyes, and a voice that carried warmth like a quilt in winter. She had lived alone in the white cottage at the edge of Elm Street for nearly 20 years. Quiet, but never distant. She was known for baking too much, listening too deeply, and gardening like her flowers were friends. Rumor had it she'd once been a schoolteacher in Baltimore, but she never talked about her past, only her plans for the garden come spring. Mourners gathered in rows of folding chairs on the dewy grass, bundled in coats and scarves. No music played, only the occasional creak of trees swaying and the distant hush of wind brushing against gravestones. Everyone from the town had come except the ones who hadn't dared, or those whose secrets made mourning inconvenient. Beside the casket sat Max. Max was a 6-year-old yellow Labrador with soft, soulful brown eyes and a thick, velvety coat that had grayed slightly around the muzzle. He had been Grace's shadow, her companion in every errand, every walk, every idle afternoon in the garden. A certified therapy dog in his younger years, Max had a temperament so gentle it was almost human. Children trusted him instantly, and older folks would kneel just to press a hand to his broad head. Today, he sat silent and still until the casket was lowered. It began with a low rumble in his throat. Then one bark, then another louder, more urgent, and then the stillness shattered. Max began barking relentlessly, straining against the leash tied to the wrought iron bench. His ears pinned back, his body rigid, and his gaze locked not just on the casket, but a specific part of it, as though something inside had moved. The crowd stirred in a ripple of confusion. Some people turned to each other with raised brows. Others tightened their scarves and stared. "What's he barking at?" a woman whispered. "Is he sensing something?" Among them stood Eli Grant, just outside the third row. At 28, Eli carried himself with the caution of someone who'd once fallen hard and was still learning how to walk again. Tall, with dark auburn hair pulled into a short knot and a lean frame that looked like it remembered hard labor, he wore a navy flannel shirt and boots scuffed by years of yard work. Eli had moved to Spring Hollow 3 years ago, after rehab in Richmond. Grace had been the first to offer him a job, and more importantly, her trust. She hired him to tend her garden, then invited him to dinner. He called her Miss Grace, and she called him Eli Boy. They weren't blood, but they were family. Now, Eli stared at Max, whose barking grew wilder by the second. He could see the whites of the dog's eyes and the tremble in his hind legs. Max wasn't panicked. He was trying to tell them something. At the front of the gathering stood Reverend Carl Whitmore, a man in his late 50s with graying black hair and a thick, square jaw. He had served the chapel for 20 years and wore the cloth weller, so it seemed. Stern in his sermons but polished in presence, he rarely smiled, yet always said the right words at funerals and fundraisers. Today, however, he did not look composed. Carl's face tightened as Max barked. His eyes flicked to the dog, then to the crowd, and for a second, just a flash, there was panic. He raised both hands and offered a strained smile. "Please, everyone, let us remain in reverence for our dear sister Grace. The dog is just grieving." But Eli saw it. The sweat forming at Carl's temple, the way his left hand clenched the folded sermon notes. Max lunged again, snapping the leash, and dashed toward the casket. Eli stepped forward instinctively, calling softly, "Max! Easy, buddy." The Labrador circled the casket once, barking at a specific corner of the wooden lid. He placed his paw on it gently, then barked again 2 sharp cries, then a low growl. The priest stepped forward quickly. "Someone get the dog," he said too loudly, his voice cracking slightly. "This isn't the time." Eli moved to Max's side and crouched. The dog stopped barking but kept growling. His eyes locked onto the wood. Eli placed his hand on Max's shoulder and felt the dog trembling not with fear, but focus. He turned to the priest. "He's trying to tell us something." Carl stiffened. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "It's a dog." But it wasn't. Not Max. Not today. Eli looked at the casket, at the old oak tree arching above them like a watchful giant, and felt something stir deep in his chest. A sense that whatever had happened to Grace Thompson hadn't been peaceful. And Max somehow knew it too. That night, Spring Hollow slept under a blanket of wind and whispers. The oak leaves rattled like old bones, scattering across the sidewalks and rustling against the shutters of quiet homes. But one house near the edge of town wasn't sleeping. A light flickered in the front window of 47 Elm Street, the house that had belonged to Grace Thompson. Eli Grant stood at the front porch, one hand resting on Max's head, the other gripping the small brass key he had kept on his keychain ever since Grace gave it to him. Just in case, he had never used it. Until now. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, the sound oddly loud in the stillness of the night. Max gave a low whine, nudging the door with his nose. "I know, boy," Eli whispered. "I feel it too." The house smelled of lavender and old paper. Everything was untouched. The floral curtains were still half drawn in the kitchen. Her gardening gloves lay folded on the table near the door, stiff with dried soil. A cardigan draped over the armchair in the living room still held the shape of her shoulders. And yet, something was off. Eli moved slowly through the house, his boots muffled by the worn rugs. Max padded beside him, tail low but alert, ears twitching at every sound. Eli's eyes swept the walls, the shelves, the hearth. He had spent enough time here to know what belonged and what didn't. But the energy tonight it was heavy, like the rooms themselves were holding their breath. In Grace's bedroom, the bed was made neatly, but the blanket had been tugged oddly on one side, as if someone had gotten up in a hurry. The glass of water on her nightstand was untouched, but next to it sat a book, The Secret Life of Bees, with a bookmark sticking out 2/3 of the way in. Grace never left books unfinished. Eli walked to the writing desk under the window, the one Grace used for her letters. The desk was clean, except for a closed journal bound in dark green leather. It looked worn, the corners frayed, the edges softened from years of turning pages. Eli sat down slowly and opened it. The first few pages were harmless garden notes, recipes, reminders to call her niece in Charleston. But as he flipped deeper, the tone shifted. Entries became fragmented, erratic. Mentions of Carl, the money, and hiding the truth began to appear again and again. April threered. He told me I was imagining things. But I know what I saw. Why would the back storage room be locked unless there was something he didn't want found? I'm afraid, but I can't keep quiet forever. April 15th. I confronted him today. He smiled, but his eyes, they were cold. Said it was all for the good of the church, that I'd ruin everything if I kept digging. But it's not right. I've started writing a letter to the council, just in case. Eli flipped to the end of the journal. A folded piece of stationery slipped out. It was addressed, but not mailed. The letterhead read Spring Hollow Church Council, and the contents were damning. To whom it may concern. It is with a heavy heart that I write this. I fear Reverend Carl Whitmore has been misusing church donations for purposes unrelated to our community. I've found discrepancies in the treasury records and have seen him meeting with individuals late at night, carrying envelopes I know did not belong to him. The letter trailed off, unfinished. Max let out a low bark, causing Eli to look up. The dog stood at the doorway, tail stiff, ears forward. He trotted down the hall and stopped at the basement door, pawing it lightly. Eli followed. The basement was dark and smelled of mildew. Eli flicked the light switch. Nothing. He found a flashlight in the kitchen and returned, the beam slicing through the shadows. Boxes of old photographs, holiday decorations, and gardening tools were stacked neatly, but one section of the wall looked newer than the rest. A false panel? Eli approached and ran his hand along the wood. Max sniffed beside him, then suddenly began to scratch the base of the panel. With effort, Eli pried it open and found a narrow cavity. Inside sat a lockbox, covered in dust. It was empty except for a torn envelope and a flash drive. Eli pocketed them both. He returned upstairs, heart pounding. If Grace had been gathering evidence against Reverend Whitmore, if she had planned to expose him, what if her death wasn't natural at all? And why had the funeral felt so staged? The last time Eli saw Grace alive had been just 2 weeks earlier. She had looked tired but determined. She had handed him a small tray of lemon bars and asked him to trim the hedge along the west side of the garden, but her eyes, they had a weight to them, like someone who knew time was running short. Back in the living room, Eli sank into the armchair. Max curled at his feet. He held the journal in one hand and the letter in the other, the weight of truth pressing down on his chest. He thought of Reverend Carl's face at the funeral, the sweat, the quickened breath, the bark of command when Max approached the casket. Eli didn't know what had happened to Grace. Not yet, but he knew one thing for sure now. Max had been right to bark. The next morning in Spring Hollow dawned with a gray mist hanging over the streets like gauze. The chapel bell didn't ring, though it usually did every Sunday. Eli stood across the road from St. Jude's, one hand resting on Max's leash, the other gripping the small brass key he had retrieved from Grace's journal. He hadn't slept, but exhaustion couldn't smother the fire of suspicion growing inside him. Something had to be hidden in that church, and today he was going to find it. St. Jude's Chapel was a modest, white-clappered building with a steeple that leaned just slightly to the left, a detail most folks in town pretended not to notice. The windows were tall and narrow, the stained glass faded by decades of sun. Eli waited until the streets thinned out, then approached the side entrance near the vestry, a small wooden door most congregants never used. It was unlocked. He stepped inside with Max close behind. The scent of beeswax and old wood filled the space, the silence thick enough to hear the creak of every floorboard. Eli moved past the pews, past the pulpit, until he reached the altar. Behind it stood the sacristy door where the vestments and church records were kept. The room was dim and cold. To the right, beneath a faded oil painting of St. Jude, was the storage room. Eli flicked on the light. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each stacked with candles, hymnals, seasonal decorations, and faded paperwork. But something caught his attention near the back, a section of the wall, with a cleaner paint tone, almost new. At the base, hidden beneath a curtain of fabric used for altar linens, was a small wooden door flush with the floor. There was no handle, just a keyhole. Eli knelt and glanced at Max. "This has to be it," he muttered. The key slid in with a soft click, and the door opened with a groan of old hinges. Behind it, A narrow stone staircase descended into darkness. Eli grabbed a flashlight from the top shelf and descended slowly. Max followed without hesitation. The stairs opened into a stone chamber, silent and windowless. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, but what they held sent a chill through Eli. Dozens of envelopes, each labeled with dates and names of church members people he knew. Each one contained stacks of cash, some bundled with rubber bands, others stuffed loosely. Eli's breath caught. Donations, all of it. To the left of the shelves, beneath a dusty linen cloth, sat a locked filing box. It bore Grace's handwriting in blue ink. Confidential. Church correspondence. No lock resisted the small key this time. Inside were letters copies of documents Grace had apparently collected. Most were addressed to church officials, to external oversight committees, even to a local journalist named Tom Ridley, a man Eli had heard of but never met. The tone of each letter grew more urgent. To the diocese committee, I am writing once again regarding financial irregularities within St. Jude's Chapel. I have documented multiple instances of unauthorized cash movement, false record-keeping, and potential misuse of charitable funds by Reverend Carl Whitmore. Another letter, dated only a week before Grace's death, was stark in its warning. I have confronted Reverend Whitmore directly. He denied everything. I fear retaliation. If anything happens to me, I ask that these letters be delivered and that a formal investigation begin. This is not just about money, it is about trust, about faith, and about the lives he's affecting. Eli stared at the letter, Max sitting solemnly at his side. The words rattled through his bones. Grace had known. She had tried to stop him, and now she was gone declared dead after a sudden illness. With no autopsy, no questions asked. Poison? Eli didn't want to believe it, but doubt had rooted too deeply. He heard a creak from the floor above. Max's ears perked. They froze, then silence. Eli stuffed the letters back into the box and carefully closed the hidden door before heading back upstairs. He locked the sacristy behind him and slipped out the side entrance just as the first sounds of the town waking up echoed across the street. Later that afternoon, Eli made his way to the outskirts of Spring Hollow to find Tom Ridley, the journalist mentioned in Grace's letters. Tom lived alone in a weathered brick cottage behind a thicket of pines. In his late 50s, Tom was tall and slightly stooped, with graying red hair and sharp gray eyes that scanned like searchlights. He had a reputation for being blunt, skeptical, and fiercely protective of truth. Tom opened the door with a mug in hand. "You're Eli Grant," he said before Eli could speak. "I know your face from the garden center. What's this about?" "I think you knew Grace Thompson," Eli began. Tom's brow furrowed. "I did. She sent me letters. I never got a reply out to her before. Well, before the news came." Eli handed him one of the letters from the lockbox. "She kept copies. She knew something. I think she was murdered." Tom's face hardened. He stepped aside. "Come in." As Max curled at Eli's feet by the fireplace, the two men spread out the letters and reviewed them. The journalist's jaw tightened the more he read. "This is enough to start asking real questions," Tom muttered. "If the diocese doesn't act, the state attorney might." Eli nodded. "But we can't go public yet. Not without more. People love Reverend Carl. They'll think we're slandering him." Tom looked over his glasses. "Then we get more. And when we do, we bury him with his own lies." Outside, dusk settled over Spring Hollow, like a secret being whispered too quietly to catch. But Eli now had allies, and with Max beside him, there was no turning back. The chapel glowed with amber light as the townspeople filtered in, clutching hymn books and murmuring pleasantries under their breath. It was the first evening service since Grace's funeral, and the air outside still carried the smell of wet bark and cold soil. Eli stood just beyond the chapel entrance, one hand pressed against the wooden frame of the doorway, the other steadying Max's leash. Max, quiet but alert, stood beside him, golden fur shimmering faintly beneath the gas lamp glow. Inside, Reverend Carl Whitmore adjusted the collar of his black cassock. He was composed as always, standing before the altar with his shoulders back, hands folded, voice as smooth as rain on slate. At 57, Carl had the kind of appearance that drew clean-shaven, neatly parted silver-black hair, steel-gray eyes that rarely blinked. But Eli had seen those eyes shift, had watched the veneer of calm crack when Max barked at Grace's casket. And tonight, he planned to expose the truth. Eli stepped into the aisle as the congregation settled. His presence drew attention whispers, stirred like dry leaves. At the front, Carl paused in mid-prayer, blinking as Eli began to walk slowly toward the altar. Tom Ridley, the journalist with sharp features and a denim jacket that hadn't changed since 1994, slipped in quietly behind Eli, carrying a leather satchel over his shoulder. He gave Eli a single nod. Inside the bag were the letters, the evidence, the flash drive, everything Grace had risked her life for. Carl's voice wavered as he tried to resume. "And may we remember that the Lord does not turn a blind eye to truth," Eli said aloud. The room fell still. Max stood at Eli's side like a sentinel, ears pricked, tail low. Carl stepped down from the pulpit, his tone strained but measured. "Eli," he said, with the hint of a forced smile, "this isn't the time for disruption. If you have grief to work through, I would be happy to speak with you privately." Eli's voice rose slightly, calm but firm. "I'm not here to grieve. I'm here because Grace Thompson tried to tell the truth, and someone tried to silence her." Gasps echoed through the room. Someone in the back muttered, "What's he talking about?" Carl's posture stiffened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Grant. I suggest you stop now before you embarrass yourself." Tom pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to a woman in the front pew, Nancy Carter, the town librarian and an elder in the church. Nancy, tall and willowy, always dressed in gray and carried an air of gentleness honed from decades of quiet reading and raising 4 children alone. Her eyes scanned the papers quickly, her lips parted. She looked up, stunned. "This is Grace's handwriting," she said aloud. Carl turned pale. "This is slander," he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." Eli took a step closer. "She found out you were stealing money off the books, from donation envelopes, over years. She wrote to the diocese. She collected evidence. And she gave it to people she trusted in case something happened to her." Carl's face twisted. She was confused. She made mistakes. "She wasn't confused when she wrote about you threatening her," Eli said. "And she wasn't confused when she said she feared being poisoned." The room erupted in whispers. Carl's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, chest rising with every breath. Max growled, low and steady. "You think anyone will believe a dog and a recovering drunk?" Carl spat. Eli stood his ground. "They believe Grace. They believe what's in those letters." Carl's calm broke. With a sudden motion, he turned, yanking a brass candlestick from the altar. The metal caught the light as he raised it and charged toward Eli with surprising speed for a man his age. Eli ducked instinctively, the candlestick grazing his shoulder. The crowd screamed, but Max didn't hesitate. The Labrador lunged, teeth bared, and latched onto Carl's arm mid-swing. The priest howled in pain and stumbled backward, the candlestick clattering to the ground. Max held fast until Eli shouted, "Max down!" Max released and backed off, growling. Carl, now bleeding, staggered back toward the altar. "He attacked me. That animal's dangerous," he shouted. But the tremble in his voice betrayed him. Tom stepped forward. "You just tried to strike someone with a weapon in front of 40 witnesses." Carl turned, wild-eyed, and tried to run down the side aisle. But he didn't make it to the door. Deputy Sheriff Harold Baines had arrived during the chaos, summoned by a text from Tom minutes earlier. A broad-chested man in his 40s with a kind but stern face and buzzed hair, Harold didn't hesitate. He intercepted Carl with swift efficiency, cuffing him while the priest struggled and shouted about lies and betrayal. As Harold led Carl out the front steps, Nancy Carter stood and addressed the congregation. "We all loved Grace," she said softly. "And if what she tried to warn us about is true, we owe her the dignity of listening now when it matters." People murmured in agreement. Some cried, some stared in disbelief. But the weight of the truth had landed, and there was no putting it back. Outside, the night was still. Carl was loaded into the sheriff's cruiser, his shouts muffled behind the glass. Tom walked up beside Eli, clapping a hand on his back. "You did it." Eli didn't answer. He looked at Max, whose tail wagged gently now, the tension gone from his body. "She did it," Eli said, voice quiet. "We just finished what she started." The morning after the confrontation, Spring Hollow stirred beneath a soft drizzle, the kind that seemed to wash away more than just dust. Eli sat in a wooden chair inside the sheriff's office, his hands folded in his lap, Max curled quietly by his feet. On the desk beside him were the letters, the flash drive, and the lockbox from the chapel basement, all of it now logged as evidence. Deputy Sheriff Harold Baines had just finished taking Eli's full statement, nodding as he typed, jaw clenched in a way that suggested he was trying to keep his emotions from spilling out. "You've done this town a service," Harold said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Grace was a good woman. I should have known something wasn't right." Before Eli could answer, the desk phone rang. Harold picked it up with a sigh, expecting paperwork or press inquiries, but his brow lifted, eyes narrowing, as he sat straighter in his chair. "Say that again?" he said, then turned to glance at Eli. "Are you sure it's her?" Eli rose slowly, heart beginning to thump. Harold hung up the phone and looked him dead in the eye. "That was the hospital. They just admitted a woman matching Grace Thompson's description. She was found unconscious in a private patient room at a remote clinic outside town. No ID, but the nurse recognized her from the obituary photo." Eli's breath caught. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. "They think she was drugged," Harold continued. "Stabilized now, just waking up. You might want to get over there." The drive to Maplewood Regional Clinic was a blur of winding roads and windshield wipers. Eli's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, Max standing with his front paws on the center console, nose pressed to the glass. The hospital was a squat brick building nestled between two hills, gray and plain, with a sad little rose bush near the front sign. Inside, they were met by Nurse Amanda Lowell, a woman in her late 40s, with curly brown hair tied back, and kind eyes magnified by thick glasses. Her scrubs were printed with little robins, and her smile was tight with emotion. "She's in room 203, Amanda said. "She's awake, confused, but she asked for her dog." Eli choked back a laugh that turned into a sob. "Can I?" Amanda nodded. "Of course." They walked down a quiet corridor with cream-colored walls and low, humming lights. When they reached the room, Amanda gently pushed the door open. Grace Thompson lay propped up against two pillows, a warm light falling across her pale face. Her white hair was messy, but her eyes, those clear, piercing blue eyes, blinked slowly, as if adjusting to life again. An IV trailed from her wrist, and a monitor beeped softly in the corner. When she saw Eli, her lips quivered. "Eli, is that really you?" He stepped inside, voice cracking. "It's me, Miss Grace. Two thought we lost you." Before she could speak again, Max bounded to her bedside, tail wagging, whining with joy. Grace reached out with trembling fingers and buried them in his golden fur. "You came back for me," she whispered. Eli approached slowly, gripping the rail of the bed. "They told us you were dead. There was a funeral, a closed casket. Reverend Carl, planned all of it, didn't he?" Grace nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He found out I was going to the council with what I knew. Said I was old, confused. Said no one would miss me. I woke up here, locked in that room, being given something that kept me half asleep. I could hear voices sometimes. I prayed Max would find me. I knew if anyone could, it was that sweet boy. Eli reached for her hand, holding it gently. You were right. He never stopped barking, and we never stopped listening. Over the next hour, Eli filled her in Carl's arrest, the letters, the town's reaction. Grace listened with quiet intensity, nodding as pieces fell into place. Her strength returned slowly, word by word, breath by breath. Later that afternoon, Nurse Amanda came in with a wheelchair. You're well enough to be discharged, she said softly. And I believe you've got a whole town waiting. The return to Spring Hollow was quiet but heavy with emotion. Word had already spread Grace Thompson was alive. As Eli's pickup pulled into her driveway, neighbors began to gather at their fences, some crying, others simply staring with hands over their mouths. Grace, now wrapped in a thick shawl, stepped down with Eli's help, one hand on his arm, the other resting on Max's back. Nancy Carter was the first to approach. Grace, she whispered, we thought we lost you. Grace smiled through tears. You almost did. They led her into the house, where everything had been left just as she'd left it. The smell of lavender still lingered. Her teacup still sat on the windowsill. She stood in the middle of the living room, Max at her side, Eli watching quietly from the doorway. Grace turned slowly, taking it all in. You kept it safe, she said to Eli. He shrugged, blinking back tears. You saved me first. Max nudged her hand with his nose, and she knelt, pressing her face to his neck. And you, she whispered, you saved us both. That evening, Eli sat on the porch with Max, watching the town settle into a new stillness. Grace slept inside, safe and free. The light from the chapel had been dimmed. The doors locked no sermons until further notice. Tom Ridley stopped by briefly, handing Eli a folder. The story's being written, he said, but this one's more than ink and headlines. Eli nodded. It's about truth, about healing. He looked at Max, who lay peacefully at his feet, eyes half closed, tail twitching in contentment. Spring Hollow had secrets once, but not anymore. Sometimes, the quiet one-us the old woman next door, the dog no one listens to, the young man with a heavy pastere, the ones who hold the key to truth. This story reminds us that loyalty, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what's right can break through even the darkest silence. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly, but it always finds its way when the right hearts lead the way. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in goodness. And tell us, have you ever witnessed a moment when a voice, once ignored, brought light to the truth? Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your story.